So good evening, everyone, to our conversation tonight with the superheroes of CELDF, the lawyer warriors. My name is Susie Beiersdorfer, and I'm the president of National Community Rights Network, and I'm from Ohio. And we also have Nancy Ward from Oregon, and she will be doing the interviewing tonight. And we have Doug Darrell from New Hampshire, and we have Heidi from Virginia, the NCRN folk. So welcome everyone, and take it away, Nancy.
Thank you, Susie. And yes, thank you all for being here. I think there'll probably be some more folks coming in, but we're just gonna jump right in with our guest tonight. We have 4 warrior lawyers representing CELDF, representing the CELDF chapters. We have Karen Hoffman from Pennsylvania, Kira Kelly from New Hampshire, Terry Lodge from Ohio, and Lindsey Schromen-Wawrin from the state of Washington. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here, and across many time zones and with busy schedules, we just really sincerely appreciate the opportunity to pick your brains, because what you do for this organization and for the chapters is so valuable. There actually wouldn't be our work if it weren't for the lawyers. So I think the first question that comes to most people's minds when they find out about the kind of work that you do, because it is so different from conventional law practices, is how did you get introduced to CELDF? And Karen, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having us tonight. I had followed the work of CELDF since before I went to law school. I was working as a journalist prior to law school, and was covering some rights of nature stories, and just CELDF kept coming up. I really admired the ethos of community rights, of allowing communities to be autonomous and make decisions for themselves. And so, yeah, after I graduated, fortunately, there was an opening for a Pennsylvania attorney at CELDF, and here we are.
Oh, that's great. Kyra, is it Kyra or Kira?
It's Kira, I think. But yeah, I came to CELDF straight out of law school, and I guess was kind of entering law school wanting to do environmental work, and quickly became jaded and skeptical of the traditional environmental law mechanisms. And, I think speaking to the choir here when I say that it's like set up to fail or set up to occupy people with privilege, doing futile whack-a-mole sorts of lawsuits. And I read some CELDF propaganda critiquing traditional environmental law and was like, oh, I really get the sense that that is the way things are. So I transferred my bar to New Hampshire and hopped on board, and I've been there ever since.
Very nice. Lindsey.
Well, hi everyone. Thanks for having us. Calling us superheroes, I want to push back against that a little bit, because we're not. We're just, lawyers are people too, my friend, as Mitt Romney kind of said. But if I were a superhero, I'm also in city council in Port Angeles, and Elizabeth Dunn, who many people here know, talked me into putting on an orca outfit and posing dead in front of the state orca task force with a sign that said "Death by Task Force" to critique the regulatory BS process that they were doing. And of course, we got it written up in the Peninsula News. And so my detractors here in Port Angeles like to call me Orca Man. So if I were a superhero, I think I would be Orca Man. I don't know what the superpower is, whether it's sonar or jumping or big jaws or something like that. But that has become my nickname among the haters of Port Angeles is Orca Man. But I don't think that, I think attorneys aren't superheroes, and I want to push back against the idea that this movement wouldn't be possible without attorneys. Sometimes I think we get in the way more than we help. And we'll talk about this more later, but I just want to share an article that I have pulled up now. It's an old piece now. It's a dozen years old, but it's about the idea of community lawyering, or what we now call movement lawyering. And it's the idea that as lawyers, we're tacticians within social movements, rather than being the white knight who rides in to save the community from the bad developer or bad oil and gas company or whatever it is. Instead, we are working within social movements, trying to be tactical in how we address power and how we change systems. Rather than being saviors of movements, we are part of movements. And I think that's the philosophy that all of us subscribe to in how we practice law. And it's definitely, our goal, as one of us will say more often than others, is to get rid of lawyers, because we're not, we should all be experts in what government means for us. I think there's a time and a place to defer to experts, but when we're talking about things that affect how we all live together, we should all be experts in that area. But so how I got involved in CELDF as an undergraduate student at Oberlin College, I had focused a lot on environmental studies, and that discipline really kind of thinks of three different things: society, economy, and environment. And only after going to Oberlin did I encounter the work of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund through an article in the really obscure ecological design journal called Annals of Earth, which is totally obscure. John and Nancy Jack Todd, if people know what they do with living machines and ecological wastewater treatment plants. And that article really cemented for me that my environmental studies background was missing a key thing, which was the structures that create the relationships between society, economy, and environment. And so I followed CELDF since then for probably about 8 or so years. Ultimately decided to go to law school for better or worse, as I kind of suggested there. And I went to Spokane, I went to Gonzaga. And after picking Gonzaga, I asked my partner if she'd be okay with living in Pennsylvania for a summer, doing an internship with this organization. That was one of the things that inspired me to go to law school. And she said, sure, you've mentioned that before. And so then I looked up CELDF's website for the first time in a long time. And it said, where do we work? And it said New England, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Spokane. And I said, what? Spokane? I'm about to move to Spokane. And I immediately signed up for Democracy School, which was the weekend between law school orientation and the first week of law school classes. And coming from being a science educator, I was very skeptical of this idea that corporations could actually have rights. That was pretty ridiculous. And so I was looking out for this as I started my first week of law school. And on day 3, a corporation asserted its 14th Amendment rights in a case in civil procedure. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's actually happening. Like, that wasn't just BS that Thomas Lindsey guy told me. And so I went up to my professor's office during office hours, and I'm like, Mr. Hess, I have a question about this case, International Shoe. And of course, he's so excited that I have a question about International Shoe because it's a famous civil procedure course. And I said, how does this corporation have 14th Amendment rights? And he said, oh, don't worry about that. That's well-settled law. Just focus on the civil procedure issues in the case. And at that point, I was like, yeah, this is cooked. This whole thing is cooked.
Wow. That is a fascinating story. And we're glad you're still here and still working for us. And I'd love to hear from Bill. I'm sorry, from Terry.
I end up following Orca Man. when I was an undergraduate in college a long time ago, Ralph Nader was an absolute cult figure. And in the late 60s, early 70s, he founded or co-founded a number of law reform study groups. They published a great deal of remarkable literature about the failures of the regulatory model, among other things. And he inspired literally a lot of people in the Vietnam War generation, especially returning GIs who were embittered by their war experience, go to law school and try to change things. Corporatism, the corporate state were clearly the preeminent paradigm then as now, although things are even worse in their own way now. And I straggled through night law school through the mid 70s and graduated with the intention of, I'm not from Toledo. Toledo is a city of about a little less than 300,000 people in a metropolitan area of about 450,000. Didn't originally plan on staying here, but ended up here, remaining. But I realized I was in a Midwestern Rust Belt city, and it is very easy to be a big frog in a small pond when you're talking about leftist legal organizing and litigation work, sort of what I was about. I got involved in the very young anti-nuclear power movement of the early to mid 70s. And when I got my ticket, got my license toward the end of the 70s, I was in a small practice for a while, and then when it went solo. I'm not being from Toledo meant that I also didn't have sort of a ready-made clientele of people who wanted wills and divorces done. So it was kind of interesting. I quickly, fortunately, got something of a rep for taking on controversial cases, often badly. And by the late 1980s, I was pretty convinced and comprehending the fact that corporations are very predominant in making law and using the legal profession as their gatekeepers and as the profession has their back. So I could see that the corporate state was certainly dominant, and I also began to realize that the few shards of democratic possibility in this country were worsening and being discarded, crushed during the Reagan era. So it was actually overdue when I was invited to attend one of the very early democracy schools put on by the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, POCLAD, and met Richard Grossman through a weekend of that in about 1993 or 4. And then later, I was straining and struggling with some of the activist friends I worked with commonly here in Toledo, who were also involved with POCLAD, trying to figure out how to do something, how to litigate, how to weaponize what we know, and you know, I still in my early 40s was having all kinds of fantasies about being able to somehow bring this monster to heel. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm still working on it. But so CELDF began to take that turn in the early 2000s. And I sort of loosely knew of them and through newsletters and whatnot, tracked what they were doing. And it was actually through an Ohio organizer, Tish Odell, that she became an organizer, I don't know, about 2013 or 14, somewhere in there. And she and I had worked together on an interesting animal rights issue, even though she's in Cleveland across the state. So she told me a lot more about CELDF, and I ended up in about 2014, 15 becoming a field. Not that interested.
Oh, it's all interesting. And I kind of want to circle back to Lindsay's point that you're not superheroes. And I'm going to push back on you, Lindsay, and say the reason that we call you superheroes is because you're doing the work that I think most of us feel lawyers should be doing. You are working for something besides money. You're trying to accomplish something for the greater good. And while that we would all like to think that this is the way lawyers always operate, it doesn't take us long to find out that that isn't the way most lawyers operate. And so my next question, and I just kind of like to throw it open to all of you to discuss, all of our guest lawyer warriors, is how hard is this? I mean, we know that what you're doing, we know what we're doing is pushing this rock up the hill. We're all Sisyphus, we get that. But you are too, and you are actually doing it at a different level than we are, and you're doing it in an arena that probably doesn't welcome you openly. So I think we'd all like to have a perspective of what is it like for you to prepare a case and go in and be faced with maybe a corporate lawyer that's being sponsored by really deep pockets, and to know that the chances are that it's going to be very difficult for you to be successful. And yet all of you keep going back and you keep doing that. And I personally, and I think other people too, would like to know, how does that energy keep moving you forward?
Well, just to clarify, usually there's 3 to 6 of them corporate lawyers instead of just one. That's actually how I met Terry. We were working on a case representing anti-war activists who were suing the US military and some cities that had cooperated with the military for spying on them and embedding a military intelligence officer in their movement. And I was visiting Ohio to visit relatives. I got in touch with Terry to see if we could meet up in person for the first time. And he's like, yeah, I'll be down in Columbus where you are working on this case. And why don't you come with me? Because it's always nice to have another person in the room who's on my side. And, you know, it really was like, I think 4, 5 attorneys, you know, against him. And that's just the usual. Yeah, I mean, what do we say? We're on the right side of this, even though it's, you know, it's not what law school trains you for. There's this big saying in law school of doing well while doing good, which is just attempting to inoculate soon-to-be lawyers into this idea that you can prosper in the system while trying to make it better. I think it's a bunch of brainwashing, but it's also part of this process that there's a great article that I'll put in the chat called Making Docile Lawyers, the Pacification of Law Students. They basically talk about how people come into law, specifically entering law school with ideas about doing social justice and social change work. But then the process of law school usually leaves most of them going to work for big law firms and trying to do well while doing good sort of practice. It's funny when you talk to the corporate lawyers in the hallway, they really believe that. And you know, I don't know, we're just on different planets, maybe speaking different languages.
I mean, I think you were using the Sisyphus metaphor. I think actually one of my clients has described themselves as like having the sword of Damocles hanging over their head. So I mean, the stakes are just not as high for us as it is for them. First of all, you know, it's so that for me that's a big motivator that they can't stop fighting because yeah, it's their livelihoods or their water, or you know, it's a matter of life or death for them. So I just want to point that out. But I mean, Yeah, I think it is interesting, like Lindsay was talking about with the, are we on different planets? And, sometimes you'll come across a corporate lawyer who espouses like stuff that you could very well be arguing in your case. They say like, oh, they're worried about climate change, or, that the laws don't mean anything until they're enforced. They're just words on paper. And, you wonder like, how can they have believed that and then be making the arguments that they're making? And it's like, then you remember like the money part. I think it's very easy to hold two contrary things in your head, perhaps. But yeah, I don't know. I feel very lucky that I'm able to be doing work that I think is on the right side, and able to support myself that way. I think it is a luxury, honestly. I think there are a lot of lawyers or a lot of people that go to law school wanting to do work that they find meaningful, and it's just it's maybe not that easy to find. So I am grateful for that opportunity.
Terry or Kira?
I was hoping Kira would jump in, but the air is very thin. The legal profession is utterly hopelessly bound to protect property and capital, and that wasn't that important to me, fortunately. I was also motivated an awful lot by anti-war experience, and realizing that the war machine is among the very most destructive forces against the environment and against habitability of the earth. So those are kind of the broad stroke motivators. And also I'm just habitually curmudgeon. I was a curmudgeon when I was 25, and that helps a lot. I mean, it's there are lots of outrageous things that go on. There's a class structure in the legal profession. I mean, the insiders tend to be the well-heeled, large firm types, and I've had amazing talk over my head as a small child happen in some of the pre-trials. And yeah, you end up, one of my early cases was an argument before the Ohio Supreme Court on an anti-nuclear issue, and there were 6 lawyers on the other side. So I drove down to Columbus early one morning to argue it in my rusty Toyota, and all 6 of them showed up, but it dawned on me as I walked into this huge high ceiling chamber that only one of them could talk at a time. And so it doesn't, that there are some things that you can actually mitigate or combat. But the point is, we're different, we're weird, we have values that are not strictly materialistic and money driven. And as Karen pointed out, sort of fortunate if you can, as I think is a fair statement of the other 3 attorneys as well as me, so far as I know them, is they live kind of close to the earth. They're not deeply materialistic. They don't have high overhead in order to survive and fight another day. I want to make one last comment. I also agree with what Lindsay was talking about by way of hero lawyers. What we do is profile. We lend dimension or something, and by making a litigable focus, something that might get picked up by the media, because we frame the issues or that kind of thing. But the movements are, we follow the movements in effect, and in many ways, and correct and logical ways, have to defer what the people who are really, you know, scrapping it out on the streets in the trenches, proverbially speaking, doing every day. And that's why I'm kind of gagged at the title of this, because of the fact that the superheroes are the ones who are, it isn't the lawyer class, even the working class lawyer class.
Kira, did we lose you again? I think she's having a terrible time with her internet.
I'm back. Yeah, my internet is cutting in and out, but here I am.
There you
I
are.
might repeat what's already been said, but I guess I'll just be kind of succinct with it. I think for me, it's not so much about trying to win in the court system, because like courts are like a legacy of settler colonialism in the US and have existed since the inception of this country to protect property, and are like inherently and fundamentally oppressive the way that they're set up. So I never go to courts like looking for justice to be I see my role more as a buffer between the violence that the does of trying to navigate them and the people on the ground who are they're criminalized for their identity or their like socioeconomic status. In the case of a lot of like the criminal defense work that I do for people that get arrested for kind of existing as the way they are, and a lot of our like resistance is criminalized. And I think that kind of what happens when we bring stuff to courts and like expect to favor is like, what are these initiatives down enough, then they get upheld. The courts don't see them as a threat to the status quo. And if we stay firm to them, the courts throw them out in that regard as well. So it's like, I think it helps me to go to court when I change my expectations and I redirect the conversation. I'm not so much having a conversation between the judge and the prosecutor about, you know, the legitimacy of something. I'm having with my clients, with the people that I'm trying to support, and saying, hey, how are we in this movement together? What's your goal? Being real about the chances in the court system and being real about the efficacy of turning to the judicial branch as like a semblance of justice. Trying to be honest about that and working with them to craft a strategy where sometimes the court is a different, like there's a different goal than just getting a judicial victory, because we know that that actually is kind of fundamentally a violent system to be looking to approval. And with a lot of like my criminal defense work, it's more of like minimizing the harm, violence, and the legal consequences to people who have maybe locked themselves to some form of equipment or another. But that's, yeah. And I guess one thing that I was thinking about, did I cut out for a sec? Thing that I was thinking about is lawyers as superheroes analogy, and like, yes, there's not a lot of lawyers who do what we do, but I think back then, like, people are often unwilling to exploit their privileges, and like having a degree is just like a giant layer of academic privilege. And it's the same way that are often acknowledge their risks, which is right. It's easier to just see it as normal, reflected, and that really like to end systemic oppression when we do have privileges. Like, I think it's a moral obligation we have to exploit. They tend to use it to just like make a bunch of money and kind of like lifestyle or whatever. And be right, it's to kind of not engage in with people who don't have the same privileges as us, but like recognizing that the existence of lawyers is actually harmful for everybody. And so kind of wanting to exploit this privilege, like ride it out till I get disbarred, kind of see what can happen in the time that we're given with the privileges that we have, and not being afraid to like use things for the betterment of the people that we're like, who's kind of liberating our is intertwined with. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense at all, very much. And this vision of wanting to write it as long as you can and push the envelope, that's a very captivating image. We have a question from Deborah Fant that I think is a juicy one. It's, do you find that your ethics or morals can be in conflict with what you are asked to litigate? And how do you navigate that? Terry, I'm going to start with you because you've probably had the most experience of balancing those things.
actually, one of the good aspects of being in smaller solo practices, you can kind of pick your clients, and so you can, to some extent, especially in the early days, and to some extent even now, yeah, you sort of do cases that are boring or pointless, or that you do what you do to survive, and try not to do any harm as you do that. So yes, there are ethical conflicts, but an awful lot of the reason that I've gotten involved in movements and causes over the decades is so I can sleep at night. And of course, I don't even do that very well, some people would say. In any event, the idea is to, like I say, the benefits are, every day can be a Blue Jean Friday if you're in solo practice, and you can choose among clients, especially if you become more established. The way that I have survived economically largely has been by doing employment law, plaintiff side employment discrimination, wrongful firing, sometimes unemployment cases, sometimes unusual civil rights related matters also. And then there's a thin layer of environmental or other kinds of cause things where sometimes clients actually will pass the hat and throw some money at you. But it's not been a real difficult task on the ethics side. If I've been lucky enough to sort of follow my own passions. Sometimes at terrible economic cost, but that's sort of the way it is too.
Anyone else have thoughts on that question?
I'll jump in. Yeah, and Terry's point is that we can choose our clients, and if there's somebody who's despicable, we just don't represent them. But sometimes I've taken on small town law cases, and a lot of times people can't afford a lawyer, and there's this question of how much to charge, and that's just kind of awful when somebody can't really afford it, and that's why they bumbled along and tried to solve it on their own, and that didn't work. So I think that's kind of an ethical challenge with it as well. What the corporate lawyers do, of course, if they're getting too much work and too busy, is they just raise their prices, and then they make more money with less work. As public interest or social justice or movement lawyers, we don't have that mechanism to throttle the amount of work we're asked to do. So we have to know how to say no to somebody, because there is way more demand for attorneys who want to work for just causes than there are attorneys willing to do this work or able to do this work. Might be a combination of both. So saying no to people when they have something that is an injustice that needs to be righted and they need help with it is, I think, the hardest part of this whole process.
Yeah, I would echo that. I do, in addition to the CELDF work, I do a lot of immigration work, and it's just what Lindsey described. I mean, there are lots of immigration lawyers who charge a lot more than I do, and it would be helpful if I could just raise my rates and manage my workload that way. But it comes up against exactly what he described. You don't want to be charging so much that people can't afford you, and then they have nowhere to go. And there is a moral side of it where, in terms of, have I taken on anybody that I feel, any case that I feel I'm representing an unethical position? No, I have that luxury being in solo practice. But in immigration in general, I feel that unless somebody is, actually fraudulent or trying to do something unethical, they're pretty much always on the right side, given that they're up against the deportation machine. So so that hasn't really been a quandary, but it is tricky in terms of managing caseload and managing demand, and yeah, it's just a delicate balance there.
I think like if you're thinking about too in terms of like ethical obligations and where that comes into conflict, like lawyers' ethical obligations with our ethical obligations is like I think about consent a lot of the time. Like I'm an anarchist, and anarchy is kind of rooted in consent for me, like as a personal practice and a kind of where do we want to go as a society. And the power dynamics that are inherent in the legal profession make it pretty much impossible to practice good consent culture with your clients. Like the ethical obligations to the court and to clients and to the profession or whatever involve a ton of like just like class and race barriers to access, a lot of like obtrusive legal language. Something I was like kind of working on with CELDF was reducing the like oppressive nature of our retainer agreements. Like if you want our help, read this thing and sign your life away. And like we intentionally, the practice is all about like covering your bases and covering your behind, and not so much like, do people feel like they have options when they're entering into an attorney-client relationship with you? And they really don't. And that is in part because of like this like scarcity of access to justice, this like universal need for lawyers. Like everybody needs a lawyer and nobody can afford one in order to have access to justice or to have our basic rights upheld. And that's like an intentional feature of like racial capitalism and of the legal system itself. So it's super hard, like others are saying on this call, about like saying no to people because like it's just what is the point of like a right when to have access to it you need to have the privilege of like access to a lawyer. So it's kind of one of the reasons that I think like constitutional rights are kind of functionally meaningless in our society, because they are like implicitly saying constitutional rights for people with the privilege to access a lawyer and like the luck of getting a judge that sides in your favor, which isn't meaningful in terms of like, does it actually protect us? We shouldn't kind of be like left up to that level of a crapshoot about whether our rights get protected. So for me, the most like tricky ethical things do come from saying no. And I try to kind of solve that by helping empower people to like not need a lawyer. Part of my long-term goal of abolishing the legal profession is just saying like, how can we do pro se coaching for people that maybe want to represent themselves in court? Or how can we do DIY kits or, walk people through the resources that they might need to do end of life planning, that kind of thing. But it's like super tricky just to like navigate the power dynamic, even when you're not charging people money. I don't charge clients money. I am lucky enough to work for CELDF and get paid for this work enough to like do stuff for people for free. But then when you are the free lawyer in a very small state, everybody knows who you are, and you get a lot of late night, like, I'm in trouble, I need you requests from like even dear friends, and then people I haven't talked to in like years.
That's a very interesting
thing to aspire to.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect that I hadn't thought of before. Yeah, the late night calls from friends and family. Well, while I'm listening to all of you, it's kind of running through my head of, do you each specialize in a particular area of the CELDF playbook? And are each of you called upon according to your strengths? Or how do you get matched up with the cases that you are working on for CELDF and community rights?
I think Lindsey comes in when there's a need for sonar or other, underwater. I think I've been mostly geographically based. I mean, maybe I would have worked on a few other issues, but I've generally been Pennsylvania cases.
Anybody else have a thought on that?
Actually, Lindsey is our intellectual leader in many respects, but we all kind of resolve into work gangs. Like Kira was involved in a interesting litigation mess with a small town in New Hampshire. and she sort of would tap into us for advice and, you know, sort of collegial strategizing, that sort of thing. Karen is involved in a real major pitch battle that didn't exactly look like it was going to mushroom into what it has. It's not like you specialize. The cases find you, and actually, to some extent, the people, as I say, the folks that we're working with are who set they are the guidance, the motivation. I mean, they decide for the most part, in conjunction with us as an organization, what issues would be important to take up. So we're not exactly specialized. Lindsay may have a different opinion, and Kira, but it seems to me that we kind of work in some sort of collective fashion. One of the benefits, and I have to say, I've been solo since 1983, which was, Lindsay was, how old were you then, Lindsay? Were you, never mind, you were in preschool. And the benefit actually of having people with diverse backgrounds and experiences is tremendous. It really is nice to have co-counsel and not have to work without a net, which is kind of what solo practice can easily become. So it's interesting, and it's really pretty cooperative.
I'd say, and to some extent, this is Rob's question in the chat too, but usually with each actual litigation case, there's a lead attorney and then other people who are on that legal team, often more than one attorney. And it really depends on availability and to some extent, kind of what we've been doing before. So I've often helped with ballot access cases in Ohio with Terry as the lead attorney. I've been, attorney of record on the Beiersdorfer case, again with Terry as the lead. So that part is really kind of who's available when, and to some extent it takes time to build your knowledge of a case. So just jumping in, a little bit here and there isn't necessarily as helpful because you don't have all the background on what's been said in the case over time. So like, I'm not currently part of the Grant Township legal team, but I was involved in Grant Township cases back in 2014, 2015. I don't know, it's been a while. And then in terms of subject area, our cases will often be ballot access cases. So, getting on the ballot, and that's been a lot in Ohio and Western states like Oregon and Washington. Not so much in Pennsylvania or New Hampshire. And then there's, challenges after a law is enacted. Grant Township's an example, Lincoln County, Oregon is an example. Nottingham, New Hampshire is an example. And those cases often come down to issues of constitutional rights. Well, I'm sorry, not constitutional rights. Constitutional interpretation of power between local and state governments. So the wonky word there is preemption. The more better messaging term is state interference with local democracy. So that's an area that we end up litigating a lot over. Rights in nature doesn't really show up all that much. We've tried some cases bringing ecosystems into court, and the courts haven't been very amenable to that. But that's kind of the extent to which rights in nature has been explored in court. And then, the initiative power stuff, the ballot access has, been a challenge, I'd say, in that the judges really aren't a big fan of direct democracy. And they've been really trying to shut the door on that mechanism of lawmaking, not just against us, but just in general. There's a dynamic of, local governments and communities in states that are now Republican-controlled state legislatures using direct democracy, the initiative power, to pass economic justice measures, and the legislatures and the courts have been trying to shut that down. So that's a larger national trend that we've been part of, for better or worse.
Well, and If you don't mind, I'm just going to add to this question. Bill Lyons just put in, I assume when you have a case, mostly you feel you made great arguments, but you don't win. How much of the problem is the law itself, and how much is the interpretation of the judge given their bias? So let's kind of meld those two questions. And Kira, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You can see me getting riled up about this one. This is a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's entirely just a built-in design feature of the judicial system. Like, it's not even so much the judge's bias, like it is the function of the judiciary to uphold precedent and to protect the status quo. And this United States of America was founded on an oppressive status quo. It was founded on genocide and mass kidnapping and enslavement of different people for different reasons to kind of protect and accumulate profit. And at that point, nature was thought of as like waste. The John Locke kind of like, if it's wild, it's going to waste. So that's the origin story of our judicial system, and they're bound to stick by that. And they judges get, swatted down quite heavily for like sticking their necks out. So it's like kind of, we think of like the goal being like getting better people elected to the Supreme Court, and like, with all respect for the dead, like I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg got glorified, and a lot of people are kind of taken in by this idea, we just need better judges to make better decisions. But I think about a lot of the decisions she made. Like one that comes to mind is the decision to deprive the Oneida Nation of sovereignty. There are other kind of areas, and took that to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, led by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, ruled on the basis of the Doctrine of Discovery to deny tribal sovereignty to that First Nation. So the Doctrine of Discovery is, of course, like the founding legacy of the US is like, when white Europeans found it, they created the concept of land ownership, of property ownership, and imposed it on people. And since, so that to me is like, yeah, we have these like judges who sometimes make decisions, and it's all political. Like, it's all rooted in the idea that we need to be very careful about what changes we make. And we've kind of solidified enough status quo to the point that like we need to be making rapid changes, kind of ongoing suffering in this like current corporate state, and for the future of anybody that wants to like actually see things grow in the ground. So it needs to happen super fast. It's not been with the judges, and it's not even so much their bias, but rather like the system's setting of the rules. And I think, was it Bill in the chat said that too? Yeah, the system is the problem. It's not even the judges, and it's not even the laws. It's just so much deeper than that.
I do want to talk about the judges for a minute, because I was pretty shocked when I went to law school to find out how much of the law is just whatever the judge says it is, whatever any given judge says it is. I think I had thought before that there was like the law and that everyone had to follow it, and didn't realize people were basically making it up. Human beings were making it up as they went along, given the constraints that Kira just described, which are very real. But I just got some like magazine from the State Bar Association, and I was shocked to see they openly talked about this study that looked at like judicial decisions and compared them across different things, like whether the home like football team had won the previous weekend, or like what they had for breakfast that day, or just all these different factors, and found that they had like such an impact on the way that the judges went on decisions. And I guess it wasn't shocking, but I was shocked to see it in the like Bar Association magazine. I was like, but this goes against this myth that we are all supposed to believe, that judges are impartial and just interpreting the law. So I was kind of glad to see that in there. Maybe it sort of punctures that myth a little bit.
Well, I care far more about what my clients, what you all think about the arguments we've made relative to the arguments that the corporate attorneys have made than I do about what the judge says. I think somebody on this call recently said, this is a fantastic argument. Oh, I can't believe, they've got to agree with this. And I'm like, yeah, But I feel like that's what I want to hear from you. I mean, because like, just because what we're saying, you know, isn't what the judge is willing to agree with at that point in time, doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense. And we have to keep speaking truth to power until power changes.
Well, and that kind of leads right into what I've been thinking as I'm listening to you all. Do you spend much time envisioning what a different system might look like? I mean, I think we're probably all in agreement that we would like to see the court system torn apart. But the trouble is, nobody seems to have an adequate vision of what would take its place. And I'm just wondering if the four of you have given that any thought, and if you can enlighten us as to how a brand new system might look.
I don't mind going first, but I just spoke. Yeah,
Don't
I mean, I think that's a lot of what we're doing with the community rights work in general, is we're prefiguring a different kind of legal system. One of its disabilities has been that it is relying on the courts. You know, when we just say, you know, the ecosystem has a right to exist, we're asking the judges, who we've just acknowledged, we don't really trust them to do the right thing. We're leaving it to them to decide, you know, what does that really mean? And are they going to create a whole new paradigm, or are they just going to stuff that, you know, new framework over top of existing regulatory environmental law? I think that's the risk. And so one of the things that we've been playing with in a, you know, hopefully in the next few months forthcoming ecosystem rights model code is the idea of ecosystem courts, or creating whole new court mechanisms to adjudicate disputes over things like rights of nature. And that was really a conversation that, you know, we all had, but I think, you know, in particular, you know, Ben Price was talking about juries. And as I was taking a stab at drafting that ecosystem rights model code, and, you know, we realized that we could put a lot more power back in the hands of people in a community by expanding, you know, that idea of a jury, and, you know, letting it be ordinary people in a community deciding whether the ecosystem rights are violated by a particular activity or not. So, you know, there's been different ways over centuries that people have attempted to create more democratic means of resolving disputes. And a lot of that is, you know, something that we can tap into. And at the same time, I think we need to look at some of those tools, you know, like direct democracy, initiative, and referendum, and, you know, ask whether we just need to sharpen the old tool or reinvent a completely new one.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from others.
I think Lindsey's and Kira's points are in this direction are pretty interesting. What we're dusting off initiative, as Lindsey pointed out. We're also kind of heading in a direction of advocating or seeing a greater recognition of who is rightfully in court. And that's what the rights of nature philosophy is about. But I'm pretty pessimistic that change is going to come in any meaningful way to the legal system. And I plead guilty to not spending a great deal of time other than listening to my younger, more intelligent colleagues on the subject, because I kind of figure and feel a growing sense of desperation as things seem to be careening more and more out of control ideologically and environmentally. So it's kind of an interesting race, and one that we may have a great deal of difficulty seeing through to the end in terms of any serious reform. I think that direct democracy and basically decentralization of decision-making is probably our best hope, and it'll probably be very likely in the coming couple of decades is going to be thrust upon people with the destruction of larger economic, regional and national and international economic systems.
That's an interesting thought.
I have a question or a comment to make.
Sure, go ahead, Doug.
I'm not a lawyer. I've been in court before myself, but for other reasons. But it was really hard for me to understand first how the judicial system worked, and also the general court itself, where they make the laws. And I think we were taught when we were younger that the reason why it's so hard to move things is because it was designed that way, because you could have, what we're doing is good, but if you get some crazy person in there and they can manipulate the law to their advantage, and sometimes it's very intriguing, because when you look at corporate law and regulations that have been made, that has basically created the loopholes for them to have the strategies in which they use to overrule us. In the judicial system, I always thought the judge was there to make everything was fair, but no, his job is to protect the state and the well-being of the state. So the way they interpret that, as far as what that well-being is and what's important, it seems that's how it's all grounded, but it's still open. The problem is the amount of frustration that we go through, especially you guys in the court, how to change it. And so all my discussions with all kinds of people, basically people that are part of the system in some way, either doctors, professors, all kinds of people that are part of the structure of our system that teaches the rest of us the way that we're supposed to conduct ourselves. And if you can't get them to understand the well-being of what we're trying to do, that it's very hard for them to really believe the outsider, like we're the outsiders, trying to change the system to be fair and just.
And Doug, did you have a question for our presenters?
Well, the question is do they agree on what I'm saying? Because this is an observation that I've made, and this is what they're confronted with. But at the same time, we have to figure out the strategy in which that we can win the most important people, which are point people in society, to understand what we're doing. And once they start thinking about nature's rights and talking about nature's rights, I mean, you would think that this is when it's going to change. This is when you're going to see it open up.
So let's give them an opportunity to reflect on what you've asked here, Doug.
Okay.
Just throw in, let me just throw in one quick point, Nancy. It is often said, and I think it's actually probably been proven by data, that the courts rarely lead. They most typically follow changes in society and slow evolution and ideological principles. So it may be a mistake to continuously, as many of us, including me, have to look to the courts to try to break log jams and maybe point some direction forward. I'm not sure that is their function, and there's an ongoing debate about, with activists, so-called activist judges and things like that, ongoing debate as to whether that's a legitimate purpose for them anyway. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut in on Kira.
Sorry, I also don't mean to cut in on Kira, but I just want to say Terry pretty much said what I was thinking, which is that asking a group of lawyers what alternative there is to the courts is kind of the wrong people to ask, because we're trained. I mean, we've all been brainwashed in law school. I think we're doing our best to subvert that training and use it for good. But I think I think what Terry was alluding to, that, you know, and what Doug was discussing just now, that, you know, this is something that I think organizers, I think, are going to be the key people to make this change that you're talking about. I don't think the lawyers are going to be the ones to envision it or put it into practice.
Interesting. Kira.
I swapped. Hopefully I have better internet out here. Yeah, I like really want to push back on like a strategy that involves appealing to people with certain subsets of institutional and academic and societal privilege. I think, you know, like my theory of change is like, how do we build a world from where we're at right now to one that's like everybody gets to consent to what's kind of happening to them or around them. And that really is like the underpinning of CELDF's work that draws me in the most, is like, if people don't consent to something happening in their backyard or like something happening to their community, how can they have the meaningful opportunity to say no? And that comes from kind of building that world right now. And that doesn't come from making appeals to people in positions of power to like, please exercise that power better on our behalf. It comes from, what are the ways that we can build power together and make the kind of oppressive top-down power irrelevant or neutralized in like its attempts to kind of like oppress us all. So for me, like if we're really looking for the answer, like how do we organize against the state-sanctioned violence and the kind of rubber stamps of approval on these corporations to come into our communities and to do damage to us in ways that override our consent. And, you know, I see it with, I have several dozen clients going through the legal system in New Hampshire who were arrested for trespassing charges because they sat down on a train track that was carrying a train full of coal up to the last remaining coal-fired power plant in New England, and they got arrested. And even though, you know, cops have discretion over what laws they enforce, police chose to enforce the trespassing laws that protect the profitability of this industry that is kind of dooming us all to not have a future for those of us that are under the age of, I don't know, 45. And so that law enforcement kind of just articulating like beautifully clear that cops exist to protect property and not the public interest of people who are trying to make decisions about how best they want their communities to live, how we want to kind of allocate resources and support each other. So trying to really find solutions that don't play into existing power structures and existing one-way operations of violence, and how to actually say, no, we need to dismantle those. We need to push back. We need to kind of find ways to like take our own autonomy into our own hands. And that to me does not involve going to the people who have power and trying to appeal to them. It involves finding ways that we have power together with our communities based on, you know, abolitionist principles of consent and like just respecting people for whoever they are and wherever they're at.
And while we're trying to do that to create an ecological democracy, there are a lot of people in our communities trying to do that process of dismantling the state to create a theocratic corporate autocracy. So it's a three-way fight, which makes it even more complicated. Doug's comment made me think about the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn's book. And one of the things Kuhn says is, you know, in a paradigm shift, some people with the old paradigm are just never going to adopt a new paradigm. And that's something that we're going to see as we move from property law to rights-based ecosystem law. But we are beginning to see, you know, mainstream lawyers or legal professionals exploring the ideas of rights of nature. Terry and I were on a call with a Law 360 reporter when Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed, and he was genuinely trying to, you know, asking legitimate questions about, you know, how's it going to work? Like, who would sue on behalf of the ecosystem? Like those sorts of questions. Like trying to explore this new paradigm. You know, prior to that, prior to Lake Erie Bill of Rights, I feel like it was mostly we're getting the rights for rocks, only getting laughed at sort of questions. But you know, the paradigm is changing, and you know, we have an obligation to articulate the mechanisms and details of that new paradigm. And I don't mean we as the lawyers. I mean we as a whole community, answering these questions of what is a better system and how are decisions going to be made under an ecological paradigm rather than a property-based paradigm.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
Well, I would just like to say again that the work that you're doing, you're in the courts. It's like going back to the day of the king. You had to appear before the king. It's the same kind of thing, this modern day, and the lords and the king and the ones that that have the gold make the rules, right? You're doing the honorable work, and you are bringing the discussion into the court, whether it be whether we as activists do it in the judicial not the judicial court, which you do, but in the general court where the law is made. And we're doing it the right way. We have to have an incredible amount of patience to get through it. And if we keep a very high standard in virtue of what we're doing, you will make the changes. And we just have to keep standing in there. But I commend you for all your work that you do.
Well, I would like to say that I haven't, I just think this is fascinating. And it makes me wonder is, what risks do you need to be taking? And what risks do we need to be taking that we aren't, that would move this along?
It is literally, your money or your life, right? For, averting ecological meltdown, what we see over and over again is that communities that take a stand are faced with financial penalties from the system until they sit down and shut up. And so, they're fighting for their lives. I mean, the ecosystem, the water they depend on, whatever the particular issue is in that community. And the tool that the state has is monetary penalties. There's the possibility of jail, but because this is more of a group civil disobedience using the legal system, the penalty is money. So I think one thing we have to do, there's someone said earlier about, people who are more in the system. I think we're all in the system. There's no purity here. If we have US dollars in our wallet or a bank account, like we're in the system. And so how do we break out of that and be able to get beyond this fight and have, the master's tools not even be able to touch us because, we don't need to rely on that system. I think that's a huge ask. I mean, it's very much a challenge that people have been wrestling with for decades, if not centuries. But that probably is what it's going to need to be unless we abandon, local governments, when they fight to the point of not having any financial resources left. But at that point, then the state will just come in and control them and, do to us kind of Michigan emergency manager law style. So ultimately, there's this level of control that we can't get out of if we don't merge our politics and our economics.
I think Kara can tell a few more detailed stories, but watching what is going on by way of indigenous resistance, line 3, which Kara's been involved in for some months, seems to me to be instructive. You're talking about marginalized populations that have in many respects developed their own ways of survival and are trying to resist by putting their bodies on the line in greater and greater numbers. And they're building movements with people beyond the reservations. And, the only way in some respects that I think you can achieve reform in the courts, for example, is to flood the courts with too damn many cases, too many instances of injustice, and they just basically break down from the volume. That to me is probably more short and long-term. It's something to be aspired toward, but it's happening. It's playing out now. There are many examples of resistance going on, and often centering on or being led by indigenous populations.
I think I'll just, add to that. Kind of the point of risk is not to take risk for risk's sake, right? That's kind of just like savioring or whatever, but to exploit your privilege. And that often means risking your privilege. And thinking about, for us, what privilege we have is our law degrees. And for me, risking that means like critiquing the profession while I'm in it and praying I don't get disbarred until I get to like at least maybe do some things in a couple cases for once. But like for other people, I think, I'm seeing a lot of, people on this call who have like respectability privilege. So being able to like use your respectability, like you can't, once you die, that dissipates. So like use it now. And I think people who maybe, especially if you are like an older person, if you dress nicely, if you are, gender conforming, like all of these things, like if you are white and you say things that like the queer, gender nonconforming, Black and brown, poor and indigenous people are trying to get everybody on board with, but like, and even like, it's like I can say something, but like I'm like a punk with an eyebrow ring and it doesn't go as far. But I like have a lot of really important like, truths that I want to parrot, and especially on like, in all white spaces where, we so often find ourselves, or mostly white spaces in the environmental movement. There is not enough analysis in the environmental movement of intersectionality of how police and prison abolition is actually like an incredibly effective and meaningful strategy towards getting where we need to go in the timeline we need to get there. I was kind of quibbling with my dad about this, and he was like, Kira, are you getting into police abolition because you've given up on the environment and you just want to like end or like mitigate, brutality for people right now? And I was like, no, Dad, I'm glad you asked that question. Like I'm in police abolition movements right now because I haven't given up on the future of this planet. I'm in them because I think this is the only viable way to really meaningfully address climate change. And because I think that we all have a moral obligation to look at who police are protecting, who they're serving. And, we see this out at Line 3 all the time is like, water protectors like stop the pipe, they sit in front of it and cops just brutalize them. And it's like, doesn't matter, how much logic, compassion, treaties as coerced as they were, like even the treaties are on people's side here, like stopping Line 3. And it's not enough. Like it's just like property interests are at stake. So the cops go in and they find whatever reason they want to charge people with, like attempted suicide for sitting in a pipe, which is just like baffling to me when you're sitting in the pipe because you want a chance at life for yourself, for the people around you, for this planet. So all this to say, like, I think, the best thing we can risk is our privilege. And the best way we can do that is strategically. And like Terry was saying, in line with indigenous led movements, in line with kind of what the people who are the most affected right now are saying, because the environmental movement is like relatively new, but abolitionist movements have been around for centuries. And so we have a lot to learn to dealing with like and fighting this corporate state, this settler colonial state, this racial capitalism, this treating the earth and everyone in it as disposable. Like there are people who have been fighting this fight for centuries. So plugging in and figuring out how to risk our privilege strategically, it's like a really amazing thing to do. I'm really excited to hear that question and to be like doing this work with all of you.
Karen.
I have very little to add to what was just said. I would echo the call to use whatever privilege you have. I just put in the chat that, they just announced that, 23 species have gone extinct, including the ivory-billed woodpecker. Not that anyone here needed a reminder that of what's at stake, but I don't know, sometimes we do. Sometimes we can get in our own particular fights and lose sight of the bigger picture. And I guess I would just, again, echo what all the others have said, and, look to the people that are like all of you, but, the people that are putting their bodies on the line, and use whatever privilege you can to back them up, because the stakes are high.
They are high. And, it just comes for me in particular, this at my age, it's like, yeah, I'm pretty much willing to risk a lot at this point because I haven't got a lot to lose. You know, what can they do? Put me in jail, and, you know, so even that would not be the most horrendous threat. But it would be for a lot of young people. And, you know, doing it every way I've tried to do it since I was, you know, 18 years old in the Vietnam War. And now I'm 75 years old, and we've still got wars going on. And now we are at an environmental precipice. And I'm still looking for the way that will work. And I'm looking for a significant minority of people wanting to go towards this goal together. And within the environmental movement, we have a lot of different ways of moving forward, which I don't find helpful. So I'm really wondering, what are we willing to do? So I got elected to a local office. I know Lindsey has been elected to a local office. I'm sure, Lindsey, you're finding it as frustrating as I am, that it is extremely difficult to make any minor change, let alone a significant change. And then I'm listening to you all today saying how impossible it is to expect us to get this change through the courts. And we're just about coming up on the end of the evening, and I need you to give me some positivity here. I need you to tell me something that really can be done, that's practical, and that we can do, and that our community rights group can do that we're not doing yet. So bring it on.
I mean, for me, the motivation to keep going is, I think, like I said in the beginning, is the communities and the clients that are resisting this destruction because they have no choice, they have no other option. And I did want to address what Maria put in the chat about, you know, how do we change the fact that money is the value that overrides everything else? Can we build communities that can make capitalism obsolete? I mean, there are communities, for instance, you know, there's many areas of the world that are, well, not enough, not as many as there used to be, but, you know, indigenous land that is getting encroached on all the time here in this country and lots of other places. And I think for me personally, that's sort of my, if I had to choose like one way of trying to stop the madness, it would be to focus efforts on preserving that land and, you know, the knowledge of the people that live there, just the autonomy of the people that live there. And I think that's going to be the most important thing as we go forward in trying to slow or stop this flaming train wreck that we're on. I think that, you know, history has shown that resistance is the only way, and it's not easy, and it's often disastrous, but you know, what alternative is there? So I don't know, that's not really giving hope, but it's what gives me hope, or gives me something to aim towards anyway. So yeah.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, see, don't turn to lawyers for answers. We don't have them. I put in chat one more article, one of my favorites, which is Danella Meadows' essay, Leverage Points Places to Intervene in a System. And she talks about all the different kind of points of intervention, from just changing the amount of, you know, funds in a particular account to, you know, the paradigm and goals out of which a system comes from. I think a lot of the work we've been doing has been pretty deep on that. You know, the goals of the system, the laws from which the system operate, in some ways the paradigms. But, you know, sometimes I find satisfaction just in volunteering on, you know, a tenant defense case and helping somebody stay in their house another 2 weeks. And that's, you know, we're all, Meadows points out, she reaches up and down that list of items, knowing that, when she's helping in a small way, it's not changing the system in a big way, but it is, producing a beneficial effect in some way. I think focusing on material reality makes a lot of sense in a way that Karen described. Where are lands that have not been colonized? Where are there people, living autonomously and protecting those spaces from within the system? Not to suggest white savior complex or anything like that, but recognizing that we are in the mind of the beast that is causing the damage, and we can be little prions and help to destroy it.
I don't know what a prion is, but that sounds like a good plan.
Prions are molecules that proteins that get formed by other proteins. So tertiary folding in molecules. Prions cause mad cow disease.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm typing some names in the chat of just like authors to look up if people are kind of searching and like groups. I think kind of like what Karen and Lindsey were saying, mutual aid is a really powerful way to just like create direct material changes while organizing, while like building community, like building the world that we want to see kind of out of the cracks in the sidewalk of the world we're trying to uproot. And I think like kind of what we're saying about like building the world that we want to see right now in the culture, like not to undervalue the kind of social emotional stuff. Like I think that's part of cis heteropatriarchy and white supremacy culture, is to only want change that can be quantified, or to only want change that can be measurable, or that's like glamorous and powerful. And like there's actually some just really powerful kind of intangible world changing work that happens from redefining our relationships with each other into rooted in transformative justice and consent and like just like all of the soft squishy stuff, and like that can be done through any kind of like reading on your own about how to like deprogram yourself of white supremacy culture, of these things that are limiting us and holding us back, and being open to kind of like whatever local organizing like is happening in your own area around things like the land back movement, defunding the police, like getting trained together so that you could like figure out what would happen if a pipeline came through your community and how you might resist that. And it might be an ordinance, a rights-based ordinance, and it might be that and like a, little training on like, something else that I won't say on this Zoom call. But yeah, just kind of being curious, being open to new ideas, and being willing to like plug into what's already there and then to pull it in directions it needs to go if it's not strategic.
And Terry.
Do something, especially if you were environmentally inclined, do something out in that environment that you are supposedly spending so much of your life defending. This year, a friend has taught me a great deal about soil microbes and the meaning of organic gardening, the meaning in terms of what is actually accomplished by way of multitasking, the ways that we have lost control of our food systems. This sort of gets back to my earlier point about the fact that we are on the brink, if not actually fairly far out toward the middle of some dynamic, dangerous, scary as hell changes that are going to result in a strange but not totally unfriendly form of new local mutual aid dependent kinds of economics. Kind of answer Maria's question and that of a few others. Barter is making its way back. People rediscovering old traditional tasks like weaving, that is both therapeutic, but is also instructive as to how clothing is made, how fabric comes together, what its constituents are. I think part of what I have forgotten in years and years of wanting to be an activist, 7/24/365, is to somehow get back out into the environment that I so doggedly profess that I want to save. And there is hope because you also learn about or relearn renewal.
Well said. Can't thank you enough. I mean, this has been really, I think it's so totally different than I had envisioned what I was going to hear from you, that you've given me so much to think about. I think I'm quite sure I'm not alone in that regard. And it just makes me really proud to be working in an organization with people who are such good thinkers. So for that, I thank all of you. I thank all of you that I work side by side with, and just being a part of the community rights network is probably the most hopeful thing that I did accomplish in my 75 years. And although I probably am not going to see any great win, this is a good fight. And so I do so appreciate being in that fight with you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
We're all superheroes.
We are.